Hello everyone, welcome back. So, Monogram's B-26 Marauder, we took a look at the kit last week. So this week I thought I'd show you some ideas on how to assemble it a little bit more neatly and how to get over some of the issues that we dealt with in some detail, I think, last time around. It goes without saying that this kit is going to have some problems when it comes to bringing the parts together. There are gaps, there are genuine areas of concern, especially around those nacelles. But if you prepare in advance for some of those problems that you're likely to face and do some preparatory work as well, you can get over them to a degree and cut down on the filling and sanding. Look, this kit isn't easy to build. It's not like building Tamiya's Tomcat where everything can be built, painted, assembled and then brought together in one giant step at the end of the process. You're going to have a bunch of issues to deal with, but that's part of the charm, I think, of these older kits. They tend to push you in directions that you wouldn't normally go in, and although I'm pretty sure that a lot of modelers out there don't want the kind of inconvenience that these kind of kits can throw up, and I understand that, I absolutely understand that. Sometimes it's nice to try things that are a little bit out of your comfort zone in order to create something that's a little bit different. There aren't going to be too many Monogram B-26s around these days on display stands at shows and in competitions or whatever. But sometimes it's nice to create something that's a little bit off the beaten track. I really like them. I really enjoy building these older kits. And the reason for that is because of the challenge. I build them because they are challenging. I don't build them because they're easy to put together. So I'm hoping that this video will give you some ideas that you can use should you wish to build something old from your collection. I'm sure that many of you have got collections of older kits kicking around in dusty corners of attics and garages and that kind of thing. So all being well, when you look at these ideas, you'll go, oh yeah, actually, I think that's quite good. That's the sort of thing that I could use. So we'll take a look at a few ideas that I've had for this kit over the last couple of days that I hope will make my journey through its construction and finishing a lot more straightforward. And at the end of the video, hopefully that'll get your juices flowing a little bit as well. So let's take a look at what I've done this week. There's nothing too difficult in these ideas. They're all fairly straightforward. They don't involve any expensive tools. They're just basic ideas that I've had for a fairly basic kit. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at what I've done, and I hope you enjoy this. Let's go. Okay, as you can see, I've done some work on this model. Not a huge amount. I've glued a few parts together. I've dealt with some of those sections that are moulded in two pieces, nacelles here, wing halves, and also the tail plane. The first thing that I decided I would do on these pieces was to deal with the edges and smooth those out to create joints that were as close to 90 degrees as I could get it. These old kits tend to have draft angles that are slightly off 90 degrees, unlike, say, a Tamiya Tomcat, where you can fit parts together perfectly and have them running along panel lines and disappear as if they were one single part rather than multiple pieces. These older kits don't tend to have that kind of precision. So edges such as the seen here, this is the wing root, that edge there is slightly rounded off, you can see as it shines there, and when you've got the corresponding section on the fuselage here, you can see along this edge that that's slightly rounded off as well. So when you bring those two parts together, you get the gap that you can see here. One of the workarounds for that is to smooth this fairing off here. I use a sanding stick such as this or a file and just smooth it off like this to try and create, as close as I can get it, a 90-degree bevel between this upper section and this lower side face. And then by repeating that trick on this edge here, when I bring those together, it closes that gap up almost to nothing, and then I can put a small smear of filler along that joint and blend it in without having to work on huge areas of sanding and filling, which is not something you want to do with one of these older kits with raised panel lines, because it'll destroy all of the detail in there. So I'm trying not to do that. The other thing that I've done while I'm on the subject of wings is that this is the upper roof of the Bombay, and in the kit this is moulded in place like that, and then this slides into place. I'm not entirely sure why it was designed that way, other than simplicity, I guess. You don't need a separate part then for the upper roof of the Bombay. But what I did is I removed this, and then that way I can smooth this out like that to create the joint I mentioned, and then this upper section here, that'll just be slotted into place and then glued down, and then wings will be put in. Inside here there is a bulkhead, front bulkhead and a rear bulkhead, and each of those bulkheads has got spars that pass through these gaps here. You can, if I bring that closer to the camera, you can see that they pass through here, and that'll hold those wings in place on both sides. The second thing that I had to deal with this was the fit between the engine nacelles and the lower wing. I mentioned this last week. I mentioned how poor this fit was, and I'll show you what that's like in action. If you bring these parts together, let's use this one because this is the untreated one. So you bring those parts together, you can see that there's a trough in the wing, and then this is the engine nacelle. And when they go together, you can see that there are some noticeable gaps that run front to back along there, and also on this side here. That's not great, and that's going to need an awful lot of filling as it stands there. But I think I've got a workaround for that, and I'm hoping that what I've attempted with the other wing is going to work for both of these engine nacelles and also the tailplane that I'll show you later. So what I've done is I mentioned about those draft angles. So along this edge here, what you could see on the part when it was moulded was that the angle of this edge here was something like that. So that when you put this part in place on the wing, in concert with this angle here, you can see that that's not vertical. I hope you can see that that's not vertical. So it's kind of like that. And then when those parts come together, that's what creates the gap. So what I've done is that I've filed this edge from here, front to back, pretty much like that, so that instead of that angle being like that, it's like that. So that when I put this part into place, there, you can see how that's tightened that edge up. And the gap between this part and this lower wing is nowhere near as big as it was on the untreated section. The other thing that I've done as well with this engine nacelle to allow me a degree of flexibility when it comes to gluing these parts in place is that I've glued the two halves together, but I've only glued them together at the front. So along this lower edge and also the front face here. The rear section here is left loose, and that's going to allow me the chance, when this is glued in place, to push those sections out to close those gaps as much as I can. And then once this edge here is set and this edge here is set, then I'll just bring those two pieces together and hold them together. The other thing that I'm going to do as well is, in order to try and close the gaps up around this vertical edge here and this horizontal edge, is that I'm going to glue these parts together along here and along here on either side before I glue anything else together. I'll glue them together, let them set, and then that way, if I glue them like that, I'm going to have a gap, as you can see here, and I'm going to have to force that down. I don't really want to do that. I want to try and keep any tension off this upper piece here. This is the upper section of the cowling as moulded as part of the wing. I don't want to tension that too much. So I'm going to glue those pieces together first, and then I'll glue the rear section, and that way I can make sure that there's not too much damage to the surrounding surfaces with too much adhesive in here. You can see where I'm going to need to be adding filler here. This is a mismatch. You can see the two sections there. So I'm going to fill that in. I'm either going to use white milliput, which will give me a glass smooth finish fairly easily, or I'm going to use super glue with talcum powder mixed into it. The latter is a more expedient way of dealing with that, but both will give me the same result. Filling and sanding this section and this section is going to mean that I'm going to lose this detail. There's no doubt about that. I'll have to sand around that area. So what I'll do is I'll mask off this little panel here, and then I'll fill and sand around here, and then I'll reinstate these panel lines, this one that runs across the top here and this one that runs front to back. I'll reinstate those once the filling's done with the tip of a scalpel blade. I've used this before. I mentioned this when I built my F106, was that any missing detail was simply engraved back in, and although what you're doing is you're creating a very fine trough, visually it looks like a raised panel line, so that'll get rid of that. So I feel that if I approach the construction of these nacelles in that way, filling should be kept to a minimum. I'm obviously going to have to deal with this gap here and the one on the other side, but my plan will be, instead of letting the filler go hard and then sanding it off smooth, if I use white milliput, then I can put the milliput into there and then blend it in with a wet cotton bud, and then that way I filled the gap, but I don't have to do too much sanding underneath here with the loss of detail that will no doubt incur. There's no getting around the sanding for this area here, but that's fine. I'll be able to reinstate the detail, no problem at all. So that way I'm going to be able to deal with the nacelles, which seems to be the most problematic area of this kit. The final bit that I'm going to need to deal with is the tailplane. The two fuselage on this model, two fuselage halves, as you can see, they fit together really nicely. The fit's superb actually, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. It's the tailplane that's the issue. This tailplane slots into this large trough here, as you can see. Overall, the fit between the tailplane and the rear fuselage is not that bad. It really isn't. Certainly not above and below the tailplane. Where the issue lies is here, where this fillet hits the rear fuselage. If I bring it closer, you can see that. Now, if I was to glue this part in place on top of the rear fuselage as it's shown at the moment, and leave it untreated, I would have an awful lot of filling and sanding to do around this edge here to not only blend the tailplane in, but also to deal with this mismatch between the upper and lower sections. So what I plan to do is fill this gap here and blend the upper and lower sections together to create a smooth transition. And then once I've done that, I'll then glue the part in place. And then hopefully, once it is in place, once I've got a part that is smooth around here, and this looks like a smooth section, there is going to be the minimum of sanding between along, I guess, this front edge here, a little bit of the lower edge. I don't need to touch this because obviously there's a gap between the rudder and the fillet that runs between the two tailplanes, and also this part here, that's, once there's glue on that, that's going to need to have a minimum of sanding as well, and then I can simply reinstate any panel lines that are missing with the tip of a scalpel blade. So again, with a little bit of careful thought and some proprietary work on these parts, I'm going to cut down the amount of filling that needs to be done around the tail planes. So that's where I am at the moment in terms of preparation for this model. All being well, I'll have these engine nacelles in place, filled and sanded within the next couple of days, and then I can start to think about that tailplane. And once I've got that done, I can bring the larger sections together. I've ordered a few parts for this model, some Edward seat straps, also a little kind of one of their zoom sets, which will give me some detailed parts as well to go in the cockpit, instrument panel, and some other little bits and bobs that will help out. I've also been able to order a masking set too for the canopy, and that'll cut down on the amount of time that I'm going to spend putting the paint onto this and bringing all of that together. There's a lot of glazing on this model, and it's going to need a lot of masking, so I'm going to take the route of least resistance and use a masking set, so hopefully that'll bring out all of that together nice and quickly as well. Overall, I don't think that this model is as daunting as I assumed it would be. There are still issues, and there are still areas where the model is going to be testing to bring together, but I don't think it's going to be anywhere near as difficult as I'd assumed. I think it'll come together okay. It just then is a case of deciding on a colour scheme and getting it painted and deckled. So hopefully this has been useful. If you've got one of these kits and you've got or any of the old Monogram bomber kits like this, and you're coming across fit issues, hopefully these ideas will help out, and it will allow you to sort of pre-plan how you're going to go about it before you start gluing things together in anger. I'm convinced that this model will look pretty cool when it's finished, so I think the work will be worth it, and I hope you have enjoyed seeing the parts laid out in the way that they have been over the last sort of few minutes. All being well, I'll have another instalment for you next time, and we'll have a little bit more progress. So thanks very much for watching, and take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye for now.